The crystal chandelier suspended above the main dining hall of the Gilded Lily looked less like a fixture of opulence and more like a fracturing star threatening to shatter directly into Ilara's eyes. 3 days. It had been 3 days since she had slept for more than 4 fragmented hours, and even longer since she had sat down for a proper meal. The merger deadline had consumed her existence, hollowing her out until she felt like nothing more than a shell of anxiety held together by caffeine and sheer willpower. Clutching the leather portfolio to her chest like a shield, she navigated the maze of pristine white tablecloths. Her destination was the private alcove at the back, where her boss was currently holding court, demanding the supplementary files she had spent the last night drafting. Her legs felt strange, heavy, yet detached, as if she were wading through deep water. The modest heels she wore clicked unevenly against the marble floor, a staccato rhythm that seemed to lag behind her own heartbeat. Just deliver the folder, turn around, go home. The mantra replayed in her mind, but the room decided to rebel. The ambient chatter of the city's elite warped into a dull, roaring buzz, like a hive of angry hornets. The scent of truffle oil and roasted garlic, usually appetizing, hit her empty stomach with the force of a physical blow. A wave of cold sweat pricked along her hairline, dampening the long, wavy strands of chestnut-brown hair that framed her face. She paused, one hand fluttering out to steady herself against the back of a velvet chair. Her vision swam, the edges vignetting into darkness. To her right, in the most secluded shadow of the restaurant, sat a man who seemed entirely separate from the chaotic glimmer of the room. Adrian Thorne stared into the amber depths of his whiskey glass, his expression bordering on surgical detachment. He was bored. The incessant posturing of the business world exhausted him more than the work itself. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy blue three-piece suit, his sharp jawline set in a line of grim patience as he waited for his dinner partner to return from a call. Then, movement caught his periphery. It wasn't the confident stride of a server or the swagger of a socialite. It was a sway, a fragile, terrible teetering. Adrian looked up, his piercing, charcoal gray eyes narrowing instantly. He saw a woman in a pale pink chiffon blouse that looked too airy for the air-conditioned chill of the room. She was petite, her heart-shaped face drained of all color, leaving her warm hazel eyes wide and unfocused. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been pushed off a shelf, waiting for the inevitable impact. Ilara tried to take a step, but the floor seemed to vanish beneath her. The noise of the restaurant snapped into silence. The darkness that had been creeping at the edges of her vision rushed inward, swallowing the light. She didn't feel fear, only a profound, overwhelming relief that she finally had permission to stop. She crumpled. She never hit the marble. Adrian moved with a speed that defied his relaxed posture only a second prior. He was out of his chair before his conscious mind had even registered the decision, guided by a primal instinct that overrode his usual calculated logic. He lunged forward, his broad frame cutting through the space between them. He caught her, inches from the ground. The impact was jarring, not because she was heavy, she was alarmingly light, delicate like a bird, but because of the sudden, intrusive warmth of her against him. Her head lolled back against his arm, her chestnut hair cascading over the dark wool of his sleeve. Adrian froze, one knee on the floor, holding the unconscious stranger against his chest. The murmur of the restaurant died down as heads turned, but he didn't look at them. He looked down at her. Up close, he could see the dark, bruised shadows of exhaustion beneath her lashes. For a man who had built an empire on being untouchable, the sudden weight of her in his arms felt terrifyingly significant. He shifted his grip, pulling her closer to secure her, and for the first time in years, the ice in his chest seemed to crack. The smell of antiseptic usually burned, sharp and chemical, but the air in this room smelled faintly of vanilla and fresh linens. Elara blinked, her eyelids feeling heavy, like lead weights had been sewn into her lashes. Beneath her, the mattress was impossibly soft, molding to her petite frame in a way the lumpy twin bed in her studio apartment never did. She shifted, a dull ache pulsing behind her temples. As her vision cleared, the blur of white resolved into cream-colored walls, adorned with abstract art, a floor-to-ceiling window draped in heavy velvet, and a mahogany side table holding a crystal pitcher of water. This wasn't an emergency room. It looked like the presidential suite of a five-star hotel. Panic, cold and sudden, spiked in her chest. She pushed herself up, wincing as a slight tug on the back of her hand revealed a neatly taped IV line. "Easy," a voice rumbled from the shadows near the window. "The doctor said your blood sugar hit the floor. You shouldn't make sudden movements." Elara froze. The voice was deep, baritone, and terrifyingly familiar. She turned her head slowly. Sitting in a plush leather armchair, looking entirely too large for the room, despite its size, was him, the man from the restaurant, the one she had crashed in front of like a broken doll. Adrian. He was still wearing that impeccable navy blue three-piece suit, though the jacket was unbuttoned now, revealing the taut line of his vest against a broad chest. His jet-black hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place, despite the chaos she must have caused. But it was his eyes, piercing, charcoal gray, that pinned her to the spot. They weren't checking a watch, glancing at a tablet, or scanning the room for an exit. They were fixed solely on her. Ilara's voice cracked, dry as sandpaper. She cleared her throat, her hand instinctively going to the collar of her pale pink chiffon blouse, feeling the flush of heat rise to her cheeks. Ilara's voice cracked, dry as sandpaper. She cleared her throat, her hand instinctively going to the collar of her pale pink chiffon blouse, feeling the flush of heat rise to her cheeks. You brought me here?" "You didn't leave me much choice when you collapsed at my feet," Adrian said, his tone unreadable. He stood up, the movement fluid and commanding. As he stepped into the light, the sheer presence of him seemed to shrink the room. Elara looked down at herself. Her pencil skirt was rumpled, and she felt acutely aware of how small and fragile she looked against the sterile luxury of the bed. Men like Adrian, titans of industry, figures cut from marble and old money, don't wait in hospital rooms. They delegate. They call assistants. They leave. I need to leave," Elara stammered, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. Her head spun dizzily, the world tilting on its axis. "I can't afford this. This room, the private care. I don't have insurance that covers VIP wings." "Lie down, Elara." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an executive order delivered with a velvet touch. She paused, startled by the sound of her own name on his lips. She hadn't realized he knew it. "Mr. Adrian," he corrected, stopping at the foot of her bed. He rested his hands on the railing, leaning in slightly. The scent of sandalwood and expensive cologne drifted over her, overpowering the vanilla. I can't accept that," she protested, gripping the high thread count sheets until her knuckles turned white. Her warm hazel eyes widened, pleading with him to understand the boundaries of her world. She was invisible. She was the background noise in the lives of men like him. She wasn't a charity case. "I'll pay you back. I have savings. I can—" "It's not a debate," Adrian cut in, his charcoal eyes softening just a fraction, though his jaw remained set in a stubborn line. He reached out, his large hand hesitating for a microsecond before gently adjusting the blanket near her feet. The intimacy of the gesture baffled her. "Rest," he commanded softly. "We have things to discuss when the doctor clears you, but for now, you are my responsibility." Elara sank back against the pillows, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was used to being overlooked, to being the girl who fetched the coffee or held the door. Being the sole focus of Adrian's intense, unwavering attention was a different kind of dizziness entirely. The glass facade of Thorn Enterprises rose like a monolithic shard of obsidian against the midday sun, reflecting a distorted, insignificant version of Alara as she stood on the pavement below. She smoothed the front of her pale pink chiffon blouse for the 10th time, her fingers trembling slightly against the fabric. It was the only professional top she had left that didn't smell like the stale coffee of her previous office, the one she had been unceremoniously escorted out of less than 24 hours ago. Gross negligence due to health instability. That was the phrase HR had used. It was a polite way of saying she was a liability because she had dared to collapse from exhaustion in the presence of a VIP. Clutching the heavy leather strap of her handbag, Alara forced her legs to move. The email from Thorne's legal department had been vague, citing a formal discussion regarding the incident. To her, it read like a threat. A lawsuit for emotional distress? Public embarrassment? She had barely enough in her savings to cover rent, let alone a legal battle with a titan like Adrian Thorne. The elevator ride to the top floor was a silent vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of her lungs. When the doors slid open, the air was cooler, scented with sharp cedar and something sterile, like ozone. "Mr. Thorne is expecting you." The receptionist didn't even look up. Alara walked down the long carpeted corridor, her heels sinking into the plush pile, silencing her approach. The double doors at the end were mahogany, imposing and heavy. She knocked, her knuckles rapping hollowly against the wood, and a deep, resonant voice commanded her to enter. Adrian Thorne was not sitting behind his desk. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city that seemed to shrink beneath his gaze. He was exactly as she remembered from the haze of her fainting spell, tall, with shoulders that strained the fabric of a tailored navy blue three-piece suit. He turned slowly. His face was a study in sharp angles, from the aggressive cut of his jawline to the high cheekbones. But it was his eyes, piercing charcoal gray, that pinned her to the spot. They were intelligent, calculating, and devoid of warmth. "Miss Vance," he said. It wasn't a greeting, it was an acknowledgement of a variable entering his equation. "Sit." Alara remained standing, her grip on her bag tightening until her knuckles turned white. "Mr. Thorne, if this is about the restaurant, I sincerely apologize for the disruption. I've already been terminated from my position. I have no assets for you to sue for." Adrian Thorne tilted his head, a single eyebrow arching upward. He moved toward his desk, his stride predatory and fluid, like a panther circling his territory. He picked up a thick manila folder and dropped it onto the glass surface. The thud echoed in the silence. "I am aware you were fired, Alara. That is precisely why you are here." He rested his hands on the back of his leather chair, leaning forward. The shift in posture brought him closer, and Alara caught the faint, intoxicating scent of bergamot and expensive scotch. "My legal team drafted a non-disclosure agreement regarding your medical event," he said, his voice low. Alara's breath hitched. "Then why am I here?" "Because before you collapsed at my table, I watched you handle 3 incompetent waiters, a mix-up with the reservation, and a spilled wine glass with surgical precision," Adrian said. "You were exhausted, clearly malnourished, and running on fumes, yet you maintained perfect order until your body literally gave out." He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "My life is chaos, Miss Vance. I am surrounded by yes-men and people who crumble under pressure. I don't need a sycophant, I need a shield. I need someone who will work until they drop to ensure my schedule is executed flawlessly." Alara stared at him, her mouth parting slightly. The humiliation of her firing was still fresh, stinging like an open wound, and here he was poking at it, not to mock her, but to appraise her value. "Are you," she swallowed the lump in her throat, "are you offering me a job?" "I am offering you a lifeline," Adrian corrected, his gaze dropping to the pencil skirt that was slightly too loose on her petite frame. Executive assistant, triple your previous salary, full benefits, but you belong to the company. My schedule becomes your scripture. He pushed the folder toward her. It wasn't a lawsuit, it was a contract. Well, he challenged, the ghost of a smirk touching his lips. Do you want to go back to the unemployment line, or do you want to run this city? Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 45th floor, a chaotic, drumming rhythm that seemed to mock the hermetic silence of the executive suite. Inside, the air was cool, conditioned to a sterile perfection that raised gooseflesh along Alara's arms beneath the sheer fabric of her pale pink chiffon blouse. She shifted in her chair, the pencil skirt restricting her movement just enough to remind her of where she was and who she was with. Across the expanse of the mahogany desk, Adrian sat motionless. The glow of his monitor carved the sharp angles of his jawline out of the dimness, casting deep shadows beneath his high cheekbones. He had discarded the jacket of his tailored navy blue three-piece suit hours ago, and his vest was unbuttoned at the bottom, the tie loosened at his collar. It was a rare state of disarray for a man who usually wore his clothing like armor. Alara watched him over the rim of her coffee cup. For the last 3 hours, the only sounds had been the click of keyboards and the scratching of his fountain pen. But now she saw something else. She saw the way his hand lingered over his eyes, rubbing the bridge of his nose in a gesture of profound exhaustion. Beneath the billionaire title and the icy reputation, there was a solitude that felt heavy enough to crush bone. He wasn't just working, he was hiding. "You're staring, Miss Vance." His voice cut through the quiet, low and textured like gravel. He didn't look up. Heat flared in Alara's cheeks. "I was just thinking that the merger contracts are finished, sir. We could call it a night." Adrian finally lifted his head. His piercing charcoal gray eyes locked onto hers. Usually, they held the hardness of flint, but tonight, under the harsh artificial light, they looked fractured. "The city doesn't sleep, Alara. Why should we?" Before she could answer, the building groaned. A blinding flash of violet light seared the sky outside, followed instantly by a crack of thunder that rattled the heavy glass panes. Then, the world vanished. The penthouse plunged into absolute darkness as the power grid surrendered to the storm. The hum of the servers died, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. "Stay put." Adrian's command came from the void, authoritative, yet strangely protective. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She gripped the edge of the desk, her eyes streaming against the inky blackness. She heard the scrape of his leather chair, the heavy thud of footsteps on the plush carpet moving toward her. A second flash of lightning illuminated the room in a strobe-like burst. For a split second, Alara saw him. He was standing right beside her chair, looming tall and broad-shouldered, his hand hovering near her shoulder, as if to steady her. Then darkness returned, heavier than before. "I'm not afraid of the dark, Adrian," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly despite her words. The use of his first name hung in the air, a breach of protocol that the darkness seemed to allow. "I know," he replied, his voice coming from directly above her. He was close, too close. She could smell the scent of him, a heady mix of crisp paper, expensive sandalwood, and the ozone of the storm. Alara turned her swivel chair, knowing his legs were inches from her knees. In the absence of sight, her other senses heightened. She could hear the steady intake of his breath, feel the radiating warmth of his body cutting through the air-conditioned chill. The desk, the contracts, the hierarchy, it all dissolved in the shadows. "You don't have to be alone," she said, softly, the admission terrifyingly honest. She felt his hand move, his fingers brushing against her arm, warm and rough against the cool chiffon. It wasn't a professional touch, it was an anchor. "Tonight," Adrian murmured, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in her chest, I think that is the only negotiation I'm interested in. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom didn't just shimmer, they assaulted the senses, casting a diamond-hard brilliance over a sea of designer silk and old money. Ilara tightened her grip on the flute of champagne she hadn't dared to sip, the stem fragile against her trembling fingers. Despite the breathtaking pale pink gown Adrian had insisted upon, a garment that flowed like liquid pearl over her petite frame, she still felt like the modest assistant in a chiffon blouse who had fainted in the cafeteria just weeks ago. Beside her, Adrian stood like a monolith amidst the shifting tide of elites. The tailored navy blue fabric of his tuxedo stretched taut across his broad shoulders, outlining a stature that commanded attention without demanding it. He was currently engaged in a low, intense conversation with a banking magnate, yet his hand remained steadfast against the small of her back, a warm, heavy anchor keeping her from drifting away. "You look like you're plotting an escape," a voice purred, dripping with saccharine malice. Ilara turned, finding herself cornered by a woman who looked as though she had been poured into a crimson dress that cost more than Ilara's childhood home. It was Veronica Sterling, a socialite whose family owned half the skyline, and whose interest in Adrian was an open secret in the city tabloids. "I'm just taking it all in," Ilara managed, her voice softer than she intended. She smoothed a stray lock of wavy chestnut hair behind her ear, a nervous tick she couldn't suppress. Veronica stepped closer, invading Ilara's personal space with a cloud of heavy floral perfume. Her gaze raked over Ilara, lingering disdainfully on the soft curve of her heart-shaped face before dismissing her entirely. "It is a lot for someone of your station," Veronica said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Adrian has always had a charitable streak, bringing his little secretary to the gala of the season. It's almost quaint, like adopting a stray." Heat flared up Ilara's neck. The music seemed to dim, the laughter of the crowd warping into a mocking hum. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to say she was here as his partner for the evening, but the crushing weight of imposter syndrome sealed her throat. "I didn't realize my choices required a peer review, Veronica." The voice was a low, baritone rumble, smooth as velvet, but cold as ice. Adrian had turned from his conversation, stepping seamlessly between Ilara and the socialite. The warmth of his body radiated against Ilara's side, shielding her. Veronica's smile faltered, replaced by a flustered flutter of eyelashes. "Adrian, darling, I was simply making conversation. I wouldn't want the poor girl to feel overwhelmed." Adrian didn't smile. His jawline, sharp and tense, looked carved from granite under the ballroom lights. His piercing, charcoal gray eyes bore down on Veronica with a terrifying, silent intensity that sucked the air out of the immediate vicinity. "Ilara isn't a project, nor is she a charity case," Adrian said, his voice pitched just loud enough to turn heads in their circle. He shifted his stance, his hand sliding from the small of her back to wrap possessively around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. It was a gesture of ownership, primal and undeniable. The silence that followed was deafening. Veronica paled, mumbling a hasty, incoherent apology before melting back into the crowd. Ilara looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched the hard lines of Adrian's profile as he looked down at her. The cold predator who had just decimated a socialite vanished, replaced by the man who had caught her when she fell. "Are you all right?" he asked, his thumb brushing the fabric at her waist. "I think so," Ilara breathed, the realization settling deep in her chest. He hadn't just protected his employee, he had staked a claim. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Adrian murmured, guiding her deeper into the room, his grip unyielding. "Just don't let go of my arm." The air in the penthouse office was so thick with tension, it felt physical, a heavy blanket that muffled the hum of the city 30 stories below. On the wall-mounted screen, a muted news anchor gestured wildly next to a graphic that read, "Sterling Corp, the fall of a titan." Adrian stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the room. His tailored navy blue three-piece suit, usually worn like armor, seemed to hang heavy on his broad shoulders today. He was staring into the gray abyss of the skyline, but Ilara knew he wasn't seeing the view. He was seeing the end of everything he had built. "Sign the papers, Ilara." His voice was a low baritone, stripped of its usual velvety command, leaving only a cold, jagged edge. Ilara looked down at the obsidian mahogany desk. A termination agreement lay there, crisp and white against the dark wood. Beside it was a severance check with a number so large it was insulting, a golden parachute designed to push her out the door before the crash. She didn't pick up the pen. She smoothed the front of her pale pink chiffon blouse, her fingers trembling slightly, before clasping her hands together to study them. "No," she said softly. Adrian turned slowly. The movement was sharp, predatory. His charcoal gray eyes were stormy, flashing with a mix of exhaustion and irritation. The sharp line of his jaw was clenched tight, a telltale sign that he was losing patience. "Excuse me?" "I said no." Ilara stood up, her petite frame looking fragile in the cavernous office, yet she planted her feet firmly. "The audit starts tomorrow morning. If you fire me now, the board will see it as an admission of guilt. They'll think you're purging evidence, not personnel." "I don't care what the board thinks," Adrian snapped, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He stopped inches from her, looming tall and imposing. The scent of him, sandalwood, rain, and stress, filled her senses. "I didn't ask for protection," Ilara countered, craning her neck to meet his gaze, refusing to be intimidated by his height or his anger. "And I didn't sign on just to run away when things get complicated." "This isn't complicated, Ilara." He slammed a hand on the desk, the sound cracking through the quiet room like a gunshot. "Why are you being so stubborn? Take the money, get out while you still have a reputation." "Because I know you didn't do it." The shout tore from her throat, raw and desperate. The silence that followed was sudden and deafening. Ilara stepped around the desk, invading his personal space, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I know who you are, Adrian. You are arrogant and demanding and impossible, but you are honorable. You didn't embezzle those funds." Adrian looked down at her, his charcoal eyes widening slightly. The mask of the ruthless CEO slipped, revealing a man who was terrified, not for himself, but for her. "It doesn't matter what you believe," he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "I am toxic right now. Being near me will destroy you." "Then let it," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not leaving you alone in this." He stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, searching for any sign of hesitation in her warm hazel eyes. When he found none, something inside him seemed to snap. The professional distance he had maintained for months shattered. He reached out, his large hands grasping her shoulders, pulling her closer until the toes of her shoes bumped against his. The heat of his palms burned through the thin fabric of her blouse. "Do you have any idea what you are doing to me?" he rasped, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "I am trying to be noble. I am trying to do the right thing and send you away. Because if you stay, I don't think I can keep my hands off you anymore. I can't pretend that you're just an assistant." Ilara's breath hitched. The confession hung in the air, electric and dangerous. "Then don't pretend," she whispered. Adrian let out a sound that was half groan, half surrender. He released her shoulders and cupped her face, his thumbs tracing the soft curve of her cheekbones. The contract lay forgotten on the desk behind her, unsigned and irrelevant. In the dim light of the office, with the world crumbling outside the window, the only thing that mattered was the frantic, beating pulse beneath his fingertips. The heavy mahogany doors of Le Ciel swung open, ushering them into a world of hushed conversations and the delicate clinking of silver against bone china. For Ilara, the sensory memory was immediate and visceral. The scent of truffles and old leather, the low hum of power dining, the overwhelming dizziness that had once claimed her right here on this plush carpet. But tonight, the floor beneath her heels felt solid. Adrian guided her with a firm hand pressed against the small of her back. The warmth of his touch burned through the delicate fabric of her pale pink chiffon blouse, a tether grounding her to the present. He wasn't the distant, terrifying figure she had collapsed in front of months ago. He was the man who had just dismantled a corporate coup to protect her, the man whose charcoal gray eyes were currently scanning the room, not for threats, but for their table. Table 4, Adrian murmured to the maitre d', his voice a low baritone that vibrated in Ilara's chest. Her breath hitched. Adrian, that's the scene of the crime, he finished, glancing down at her. His sharp jawline softened, the corner of his mouth ticking up in a ghost of a smile. They were seated at the secluded corner table near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. It was the exact spot where Ilara had stood trembling with a stack of files before her world went black. Now she sat across from him, the candlelight dancing in her warm hazel eyes. Adrian didn't look at the menu. He sat back, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his tailored navy blue vest. He looked every inch the apex predator of the business world. Yet there was a new stillness in him, a quiet vulnerability that only she was permitted to see. "I hated this place for a long time," Ilara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She traced the rim of her water glass. "I felt weak here. I felt invisible." "You were never invisible, Ilara." Adrian leaned forward, invading her personal space in that way that the rest of the room dissolved into mist. He rested his elbows on the pristine white tablecloth, locking his gaze with hers. "When you fell," he began, his voice dropping to a rougher timbre, "I didn't just catch an employee. I caught the only thing that has made sense in my life for the last 10 years. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that rivaled the night she fainted. But this was born of hope, not exhaustion. She watched the way the city lights reflected in his jet-black hair, noting the slight tension in his brow. He was nervous. The great Adrian Thorne was nervous. "We solved the crisis, Ilara. The board is handled. The company is safe," he said, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. His palm was warm, calloused from rowing, and large enough to engulf hers completely. "But I realized something while I was fighting for my legacy today. None of it works without you." "I'm not going anywhere, Adrian," she promised, squeezing his fingers. "I'm the best assistant you've ever had." "No." The word was sharp, immediate. He turned her hand over, pressing his thumb against her pulse point, feeling the life fluttering beneath her skin. "I don't want an assistant," he said, the intensity in his gray eyes searing into her soul. The air between them grew thick, charged with the electricity of unsaid things finally finding their voice. "I brought you back here to rewrite the memory, Ilara. I don't want this to be the place where you fell. I want this to be the place where we started." He tightened his grip on her hand, an anchor in the storm. "I am proposing a new merger, permanent, exclusive, not as my subordinate, but as my partner, in every sense of the word." Ilara felt the sting of tears, hot and sudden, blurring her vision. The shame of that first meeting evaporated, replaced by the overwhelming reality of being seen, truly seen, by the man who held the world in his hands. Partner, she tested the word, tasting the promise on her tongue. Partner, Adrian confirmed, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a lingering kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. Stay with me, Alara, not for the job, but for the man.